EVERSLAUGHT Invasion has had my attention firmly piqued since it was first announced. Fans of 6D reviews may be aware that fast traversal-centric action games are sort of my thing, so when the highly regarded PCVR action franchise was announced for Quest, I was excited. Not having played the PCVR source material, owing to the fact that my laptop is made of mashed potato and good intentions, I cannot directly compare the two. My research, however, indicates that Invasion could be best viewed as a riff on the EVERSLAUGHT franchise, rather than a dedicated port. With that in mind, I was able to enter my time with Mobex's maiden voyage into mobile VR with relatively limited preconceptions and robustly high hopes. For those of you who have shared my anticipation, I have some good news and some bad news. Which would you like first? EVERSLAUGHT Invasion is an unapologetic wave brawler aiming to deliver fast-paced combat, intense movement, and a strong focus on melee combat. The scant narrative is delivered in the form of a stoically animated intro sequence, complete with gritty voiceover and a sense of high melodrama. This briskly extols the fact that you, dear player, are not only a warrior cleric, but also humanity's last hope of survival.
Humanity's last hope.
Humanity's last hope.
Humanity's last hope.
Humanity's last hope.
Against the rather vague and kind of generic invasion of darkness. War and peace, this is not. With that out of the way, players can divest themselves of any notions of character or world building and instead grab some sharp, pointy things. EVERSLAUGHT is not here to tell you a story. It's here as an excuse for violence. After an engaging tutorial, the player is free to roam the steampunk-inspired airship that is your base of operations, complete with an initially empty weapons rack and a needlessly large war table. Here you can gear up, meet with fellow clerics for multiplayer shenanigans, or otherwise prepare for battle before being unceremoniously dropped directly into the carnage. It's hardly a social hub, but it serves well as a staging ground and it gives the basic functionality an appropriate sense of character. Before beginning each run, players will need to choose from one of 3 upgradable classes to take into battle. Although there are a range of subtle nuances between the classes, the most noteworthy differences are the character's fortitude and the selection of ranged weapons at their disposal. Given that you will only have access to a single ranged weapon in each run, choosing the right ballistic accompaniment can greatly affect your playstyle. Perfecting a playstyle that takes advantage of a class's particular specialty is one of the more engaging elements of EVERSLAUGHT Invasion. Whether it be a tank class wielding high damage explosive rounds, or a nimble rogue using shotgun blast to clear a path, there is a decent versatility to be found. Play with the same character long enough and you will begin to earn permanent enhancements that will persist into each new run, as well as unlocking previously unavailable weapons to take into battle. Once in the thick of things, both your melee and ranged weapons can be upgraded multiple times throughout each run. Currency is earned from successful slaughter, which is then paid into perk machines in between rounds in order to increase your stats across a range of traits. There are also skill points earned in each round which will allow you to upgrade your character directly, with the movement upgrades adding another level of mobility to the combat. These power-ups are limited to each run and in theory offer a variable that helps make each session unique. But the reality is that there is a very obvious pecking order to the utility of these perks, and before long players will have a standard order of preference, and each time through the game will become more similar to the last. One of the core elements of EVERSLAUGHT's gameplay loop is the blending of melee and ranged combat while balancing mobility and defensive strategy. Your left hand is equipped with a shield, a grappling hook, and a ranged weapon, while your right hand is deliberately relegated to your primary melee weapon. Juggling all the auxiliary combat functions on one hand, while having a single hand designated solely to hitting things, creates a dynamic with ample potential for fun. Ammunition for the ranged weapons is poignantly limited, encouraging their use against more powerful opponents or in more dire situations. Parrying a blow with a deftly raised shield, blasting and opening through the crowd with a barrage of gunfire, then swinging across the map with a well-placed grappling hook is entirely enjoyable. The Doom-like pacing of the game keeps the combat in a constant state of flux. Players trying to win pitched battles with sheer swordsmanship are in for a rude awakening, as the game requires an almost perpetual run-and-gun style approach to survival. It's easy to see what the developers were trying to achieve, and it's clear that there could be a great game somewhere within that vision. Unfortunately, despite the interesting mechanics and some solid ideas, EVERSLAUGHT Invasion is ultimately overwhelmed by the elements of the game that have gone awry.
What do you mean, Wiggle? Sorry, what happened?
If there is one thing that can stop a melee-based VR game from living up to its potential, it's the abomination that I call Wiggle Stick. There is nothing quite as unsatisfying and immersion-breaking in virtual melee combat as a game in which the velocity of your swings has little to no effect on the strength of your blows or slashes. EVERSLAUGHT Invasion stands guilty of this crime. Although some weight is factored into how much damage is done, EVERSLAUGHT Invasion ultimately suffers from Wiggle Stick so fatally as to frequently become laughable. During one multiplayer session, we completed a level with me using just flicking motions from my wrist, while Omar just walked to and fro into enemies with the blunt end of his battle axe pointed at them. I spent another run lightly bopping enemies on the forehead with the same force one might use to gently chastise a puppy with a rolled up newspaper after finding a stain on the rug. This repeatedly resulted in the enemies' heads falling clean off. Even when all the other gameplay elements are firing on all cylinders, this single lackluster implementation immediately cripples the tension, rendering the combat flaccid, ridiculous, and disappointing. This is unforgivable for a game that wagers its entire relevance on combat. Another big issue with EVERSLAUGHT lies with its collision detection or lack thereof. Enemies occasionally attach to the player's face, following inches away from the player's view as though glued to the headset itself. There seems to be no virtual boundary that gives the player substance in the virtual world. Enemies pass through the player seemingly at will, existing within the player's digital presence in a way that readily breaks immersion and once again reduces the combat to farce. All of this is compounded by the unintuitive nature of the defensive mechanics. You cannot parry an enemy blow with your weapon, so all sense of swordplay is instantly banished. This leaves the melee feeling thin, hollow, and completely one-dimensional. Successfully parrying with your shield is satisfying when you can manage it, but its execution is clumsy. When you're lucky enough to activate it, the shield projects out in front of your arm, but will only stop those enemies that were striking as the shield deployed. Attacks coming in a fraction of a second afterwards will pass through the still deployed but suddenly immaterial shield, turning the entire defensive component into an exercise in frustration. One other thing that's worth mentioning in the unfortunately long list of things that aren't quite as good as they could have been is the multiplayer component. Unfortunately, the run-and-gun style of gameplay doesn't create any strategic advantages to playing together as a team other than being able to revive each other when you go down. Essentially, you are just two players running around the same map, having your own adventure, and having a chat while you're at it, and occasionally reviving each other when you can. The levels in EVERSLAUGHT Invasion are visually themed across a nondescript Middle Eastern palette. Each pair recycles the same assets in a slightly different configuration. Although they look good enough and they are well designed for the game's style, they lose their appeal quickly due to the repetition. Within each map, players fight off several waves, interrupted by two incredibly boring, task-driven sections. Sadly, each map will force the same two tasks upon you, and they are among the most unimaginative and unsatisfying sections I've ever played in VR. Suffering them once would have been bad enough, but every single time? This is the mission design equivalent of undergoing an involuntary lobotomy. This, in concert with all the other issues already mentioned, means that reasons to continue playing EVERSLAUGHT Invasion begin to dry up at an alarming rate. Despite some solid concepts and well-paced action, EVERSLAUGHT Invasion is a disappointing example of decent ideas being let down by poorly executed mechanics and game design. Perhaps this is just a testament to how difficult it is to deliver good melee combat in VR. One can only hope that with a few improvements to the collision tracking and the weapon weighting system, and a decent selection of additional challenges, EVERSLAUGht might be able to revive itself and live up to some of its considerable potential. Until then, those pining for the perfect arcade-style combat sim may be better off patiently waiting for games like Hellsweeper or Deadhook, and hoping that they'll do far better. 5.5 Weightless. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to stay up to date with all the news and reviews, hit the subscribe button now.
I'm coming. I am coming. Well, you're moving. Where is it that was... Oh, and I found one on the way to you, so that's cool. Where is one that was next to you? Oh, I thought... Oh, okay. Poo. We need...